Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending the Finance Subcommittee meeting this evening. We have an agenda basically that is dealing with where we are with equity and education. It's going to cover basically a number of issues. We are going to have an update from Mayor Carpenter with regard to the city and city finances. We are going to update people with respect to the coalitions that are forming with other communities in the state and the events that occurred in Holyoke with respect to bringing several cities and towns together who are in a like position as Brockton. And we're also going to have an update from our public officials in terms of where we are at, where we have been, and what's going on with this issue and what we need to do in the future to be effective advocates on behalf of the city and the children of Brockton. So with no further ado, I will introduce Mayor Carpenter. Welcome, Mayor.
Well, good evening, Mr. Chair, Superintendent, members of the school committee. First, I want to thank the Finance Committee for holding this meeting. I think it's important that both the superintendent, myself, and other elected officials have an opportunity to both update the school committee, but also update the public as to exactly where we're at on school financing here in the city of Brockton and how we got to where we are today and where we intend to go from here. The underfunding of public school systems in gateway cities like Brockton is not new. We have been looking... Sully, did you have that okay? Or? Yep. Okay. We have been fighting this fight and working on this for several years. And I think what we're seeing is this is not about 1 year's school budget. This is about the compounding, continuing effect of year after year after year of being underfunded. And some critical areas of the school budget have taken hits in order that so that the budget would allow us to fund the things that were required by law to fund. I know the superintendent will spend some time talking about the impacts on her budget as she tries to put the school budget together. There have been a lot of questions about, well, why doesn't the city just put more money into the school budget? Well, we just, instead of putting in 20%, put in 25%, and that will solve the problem. And if the city had the ability financially to put in the 25%, we'd already be doing it. But the Chapter 70 formula is not that simple. And really, I think hopefully with the presentation I have for you, it'll make it clear that our problem is at the state level. It's the underfunding of the state's commitment to fund public education. So I'll open by saying that, you know, the public schools in the city of Brockton are being badly hurt because the state funding formula is just inadequate. The legislature's own commission indicated that the Chapter 70 formula does not adequately address the cost of inflation, special education students, low-income students, or English language learners. And the rate of increase in the cost of health insurance and salaries over the past 25 years well exceeds the overall inflation cost index used. Not only are they underfunding on special ed students, low-income students, and English language learners, but they've also used artificially low inflation rates that have not allowed any school system like Brockton to keep up with increases in the costs of running the schools. The cost assigned to educating low-income English language learners and special ed students especially lags true cost, particularly harming urban school districts like the city of Brockton. And to make things worse, the state made a major change in fiscal year 17 in the calculation of the amount of aid for low-income students, penalizing Brockton about $6 million. Before that change, students that were eligible for free reduced lunch programs were counted as low income. After the change, only students who were enrolled in a state-administered program such as SNAP or Mass Health would be considered economically disadvantaged. This is a much more stringent definition, and it greatly reduced the number of students who would be classified as low income. In Brockton, about 4,000 students fell through the cracks in the change of definition. The reality is that all of those students are still in our school system, and they are still low income or economically disadvantaged. If you take a look at the first exhibit here, you can see that from FY16 to FY19, while the city's enrollment was essentially stable at about 17,700 to 17,800 students, the city's Chapter 70 aid only increased by about $2.8 million, or 1.7% in total. It's a 1.7% increase over 4 years, while inflation at just 2.5% per year would have yielded an increase of over $13 million. That is a gap in revenue for funding real cost increases of over $10 million in those years, just on the inflation adjustment alone versus what the real increases were, created a $10 million gap. The state's funding mechanics for the cost of charter school students makes the problem even worse. In the period of FY16 to FY19, because of charter school losses, net Chapter 70 aid to Brockton has actually decreased from $165.4 million to $159.8. No. If you look at that chart up there right now, the red line coming down is the net Chapter 70 after the adjustment or the deduction for charter schools, so that you can see that we're actually receiving less money over the past 4 years after the charter school deduction, even though our student enrollment has been pretty steady, has not decreased. The state sends the Chapter 70 aid for charter schools directly to those schools. The city never sees that money. The amount of money that the state sends is based on average per pupil funding costs. These averages include the cost of ELS, low income, and special education students. However, not many students from these categories actually end up as permanent attendees of those charter schools. That means the charters are receiving money for student populations that they aren't really educating. And this penalizes the students remaining behind in BPS. I think you'll see when the superintendent makes her presentation, among those being penalized the most in the Brockton schools are general education students. In addition, while some costs may be avoided for every student who leaves a Brockton school to attend a charter, the average cost cannot be. Most of the costs still remain: buildings, staff, materials, etc. It takes a lot of transfers before the average cost can actually be reduced, and the reality is that students leave from all over the district, not just one school. That makes consolidating very disruptive. And then to make matters even worse, the state fails to fully fund its own method to assist communities with the impact of charter schools. The reimbursement formula calls for 100% reimbursement in the first year and then 25% each year in subsequent years. But the state does not fully fund those latter years. In fact, right now, they're not funding them at all. This failure costs the city millions per year. And last year, as you can see on this graph, the charter school deduction from our Chapter 70 aid was over $15 million. And the reason you see that spike up in the last 3 years, several factors, but the primary factor is the opening of the New Heights Charter School in Brockton. This loss of revenue that we're talking about with the unreimbursed charter school deductions and unfair methodology in calculating the charter school deductions is in the millions of dollars per year, and these losses are over and above the lost income from the change in calculation of the low-income students. So the conclusion is that unless the state renews its commitment to providing an adequate level of funding to the state school districts, especially urban school districts, then Brockton will not have the revenues necessary to provide funding to its schools. Now, this graph shows our city's own revenues versus unavoidable costs. So the baseline at the bottom is our fixed costs and unavoidable costs. Examples of those would be pensions, health insurance, debt payments, tuition to Southeastern Regional VOTEC, and other charges. Those are costs that have to be paid that are unavoidable. The red line at the top illustrates the total revenue into the city for the year. And the green line in the middle is the unavoidable costs plus our local contribution to the school system. So you can see that this year, between the unavoidable costs and the money that we sent in net school spending, direct aid to Brockton's classrooms, totals $143 million out of a total revenue of $185. That leaves $42 million remaining to cover all the other expenses of city government. And I think what this really shows is that the fixed costs, the city's fixed costs and our own obligations, which is the total of the green line, consume most of our revenue base. And this makes it extremely difficult for this to compensate with city funds for the state's failure to properly fund the public schools. However, from fiscal 2014 through the current fiscal year, we will have given our schools nearly $10 million above and beyond the legal requirement of the foundation formula. And in particular, notice in those past 2 years, $7 million of that $10 million is over the last 2 years. For fiscal year 19, we will contribute from the city budget to the school budget in excess of the Chapter 70 foundation requirement, $2.7 million over and above what we're required to send. We are sending as much as we possibly can from the city's resources to try to make up some of the gap that is created by the state's underfunding. So let's see where that money comes from. This first pie chart shows you where we spent all of the money that came into the city budget. Those are the general fund appropriations. Where did that revenue go? Well, you can see that nearly half of the general fund appropriations, nearly half of the city's revenues, go directly to the school budget. So almost half of all total revenue goes directly to the schools. Now look where some of the other categories are where our other resources are going. Insurance and benefits, we're required to pay those. Pensions, we're required by law to make those pension contributions every year. Maintenance, it's only 4% of the total. The only real, as you look at that pie chart, the only place within our appropriated budget to look for an amount of money that would be significant enough to make a difference in terms of the underfunding of the schools is the 19%, which is for, looking for the exact phrase, city personal services, payroll, city personal services and overtime is 19% of the budget. That's the only place in that entire chart where you could see any ability to try to find any additional funding for the schools. So let's focus in on that 19% for city personal services and overtime. Here's how that city personal services and overtime breaks out. This is how our city payroll breaks out. Over 3/4 of it goes to public safety, police and fire. 76% of our city personal services and overtime goes to police and fire. Only 5% to DPW, and about 19% covers everyone else that works for the city, all other city departments. So this is the only part of the budget to look at, and 3/4 of it is public safety. I, in almost 5 years as mayor now, have never had anyone stop me on the street and tell me to spend less money on police and fire. Quite the opposite is true. We're trying to keep those departments fully staffed and to protect the city and the people who live here. So I think what this shows you is that in terms of the city's ability, our ability to increase our local contribution to the schools, there's only one of two ways to do it. The first one would be to cut public safety. I'm not willing to do that, nor do I think the vast majority of our constituents here in the city want us to do that. The only other way to find additional money for the schools is to increase revenues. So to increase the revenues coming into the city, that means either raising taxes through a debt exclusion or a Prop 2.5 override, or creating new additional streams or sources of revenue coming into the city. I'm opposed to a Prop 2.5 override or a debt exclusion. That's just raising taxes over and above the tax increases that are necessary each year to keep city government running. And the reality is that most Brockton homeowners are struggling to pay their tax bill right now. And our homeowners and our business owners are already paying their fair share. We can look to additional sources of revenue, and there may be a couple of opportunities on the horizon. One would be supporting the permitting and licensing of up to 8 adult-use recreational marijuana businesses in the city. And that's in front of the City Council right now. The state law has been passed, the regulations have been set, the Cannabis Control Commission has been established, and as I've said publicly before, I do believe there's an opportunity to do this thoughtfully and carefully so that we minimize the impacts on the city while maximizing revenue, generating much-needed millions of dollars of revenue, new revenue, into the city. And that new revenue would come partly in the form of host community agreements and partly directly from the 3% local tax that's included in the state's sales tax on marijuana. And I have pledged publicly, and I'll state so again on the record today, that out of the tax revenues generated by marijuana that would go into the city's general fund, I would appropriate, subject to the City Council's approval, 60% of those revenues to the school budget. So for every dollar that comes in tax on marijuana, I would commit to submitting a budget that appropriated 60 cents of that dollar to the school budget. There has been also in the past a proposal for a destination resort casino in the city. And while that's not actively under consideration, if that opportunity were to arise again, the projected revenue to the city was $10 to $12 million per year, and I would make the same commitment to commit 60% of those funds to the school budget, over and above our required foundation contribution. So to wrap up, I think it's clear, looking at what we just took a look at, that the underfunding of our public schools is at the state level. And that means the fix has to come at the state level. We are working closely with our legislative delegation to pass meaningful Chapter 70 reforms, changes to the formula that would more adequately reimburse our school system's costs for low-income students, special education students, and English language learners. But at the same time, we are working towards the filing of an equity in education lawsuit, because I firmly believe that not only is the current Chapter 70 funding formula unfair, it's unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has decided this before, back in the early 90s. The quality of a child's public education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts cannot be dependent upon his parents' or her parents' zip code. The quality or the equality of a public school education in any community in this city, any community in this state, in the Commonwealth, cannot be tied to that local community's ability to raise property taxes. That's already been decided, and it may be necessary to reassert that again in the courts. My hope would be that with the filing of an equity and education lawsuit, with widespread support by a coalition of communities from across the state, that would create an environment in which both the administration and the legislature could find a way to make the types of changes necessary to the Chapter 70 formula that would allow us to restore the cuts that have been made in our school budget over the past few years. So that concludes my comments, but I'll be happy to take any questions from the school committee. Mr. Chair?
Mayor, you mentioned that the casino could possibly bring in 10 to 12 million a year if in fact it ever got off the ground in Brockton. What are your estimated projections with regard to the marijuana industry?
Yes, so first in terms of the casino, that number was based upon when there was a prior proposal. We had negotiated a host community agreement that guaranteed a $10 million minimum payment each year to the city. And in addition to that, that $10 million did not include hotel room taxes on the resort hotel that would be built, nor did it include revenue from water and sewer sales. So that the 10 to 12 million is a minimum that would have come. Projecting the revenue from marijuana is a little less scientific because we're sailing into uncharted waters. But we do know what the formula says. It says that the state regulations provide that the local community can receive 3% of all marijuana revenues in the form of a host community agreement and can receive an additional 3% in sales tax on retail adult use recreational sales. We have done some pro formas to try to project what we think that looks like. We think that you would see a building number each year over probably a 5-year period as this new industry and new business would get built out in the state. It's going to be generating a lot more in year 3, 4, and 5 than it would in the first year as businesses are just getting open. But we have done a pro forma. We have an existing medical dispensary in the city right now in good health that's been in business for 3 years. And under the state regulations and the state law, they are going to be permitted to go into the recreational marijuana sales in all lines of business that they're already in for medical. So that's cultivation, manufacturing, and retail sales. Looking at just in good health, and they would be the one that's already up and running, and also in multiple lines of the marijuana business, both cultivating and producing and selling retail. We're projecting that in their first full year, they would pay about $1 million to the city, and by year 5, they would be paying about $2.5 million to the city. They would tend to be one of the larger ones. So depending how you want to base your estimates, I think that a realistic projection of what marijuana revenue could be to the city is between $6 and $10 million per year, every year. And I know, having worked on, I'll count real quickly how many, I think it's 9 school budgets now, between my time on the school committee and my time as mayor. I know what several $1 million would mean to the Brockton Public Schools in terms of getting our children the technology they deserve, to getting class sizes back down to where they should be, to restoring about 200 positions in our system that have been lost over the last 3 years. I know that revenue would be critical. And that's why I look at both of those issues as the CEO of the city, knowing that we desperately need the additional revenue and what the impacts would have. And I am pledged to appropriating, and again, I've got to say, subject to the council approval. I submit the budget, but it's subject to council approval. But I would request appropriations of 60% of that new revenue to the school budget, over and above our foundation requirement.
Which would obviously be significant. I mean, you'd be talking about if both of those items ever came online, you're looking at close to $10 million a year for the schools. And that's without me twisting your arm for 65%.
And either one would have a substantial impact. And I think that what you can see, first of all, I hope by looking at the information I provided, you've seen the state's commitment to our children over the past 4 years declining, while the city's commitment has increased. We have sent about $10 million over the last 4 years to the schools over and above the chapter, over the foundation formula requirement. But I think something that's important to note, and our contribution does only amount to about 20% of net school spending. However, I believe that we've done a lot of good work so far, and if we continue this work and continue to turn up the pressure on the state, that there will be some meaningful reforms and that we will eventually see more money coming in the Chapter 70 formula. And the reason I mention that is you have to remember that means then our match goes up. So if we were successful in getting $8 or $10 million more in Chapter 70 revenue next year from the state, that means Brockton's commitment's going to go up $2 million. So we'll have to find $2 million of matching money just to match the $8 to $10 million additional from the state. So as we are successful in pushing up the state's funding of our schools, the city's funding will automatically go up proportionally because that's what the foundation budget formula requires. So although the percentage might not be going up, the dollars would be.
Great.
You know, Mayor, also, I think the thing that you cannot say enough of, and I'm not sure everybody understands the impact. We certainly did. You go back, I want to say 5 years ago, we started the fight against charters in this city. And I'm adamant about how it's not about competition with schools. You know, we can compete with any school, but the truth is that when you look at the funding for charter schools, in Brockton, we rely heavily on state funding. It's about 80%, 20% from the city. And when you look at what we get per student in the end, it's about $12,000. And that's a blended rate. And I want to remind everybody what $12,000 means per student. They look at the number of special needs students. And I am talking about students that are life skills students, substantially separate students, students that have very lengthy special education needs. And what that does when you get that money, or your English language learners, that requires more money to teach those students, whether it's smaller class sizes, additional supports that are needed. And once we're able to do this, our students have been very successful. But with that blended rate of $12,000, when you look at the formula for a charter, when they come into a city and they take students from the cities, that's where most of the students are coming from. When the student leaves the district, most of the time it's a gen ed student, and a general education student costs about $7,500 to educate. You know, they're part of a general education class with their teacher. The extra interventions and supports and services are not what it would be for a special education student, an English language learner, poverty, all of those additional supports. So at about $7,500, if those are the students that you're taking, and yet you're getting $12,000, that is a severely broken formula. The state understands it. You know, again, this was, and I'm going to remind everybody, this, whatever anyone thinks about that, this was not welcomed in the city. Every public official out there, every city councilor, every school committee member, every one of our elected officials in the legislature, it was not the time nor the place. Now, that doesn't mean that when you go back to ed reform in 1993, charters were a part of ed reform. That was part of the grand bargain. So the grand bargain, meaning the money coming from the state for equity for students across this state, they carved out 25 charter schools. We are well beyond that. And at the time, the charter schools were supposed to have some autonomies, best practices that they were to share with public schools, which have some limitations as far as things that we're able to do. And that has not happened. So the state really has to take another look at, I'm not afraid of competition. We'll compete with the best of them, given the resources and the opportunity to do that. But as you said, not only is it flawed, and you're talking, what, $10 million? So when I look at the Brockton Public Schools right now, and again, we can have a student leave us, and after that October 1st date, which is a calculation, and again, I believe they've now given us a later date to calculate our numbers. If those students come back, we do not get funding for those students. That money is gone, and yet we don't get to choose. You know, we don't have a waiting list, a lottery. We take every child that comes to our door, and we make sure that they have the best education possible that we can give them. But to not look at what I could do with $10 million in the Brockton Public Schools for curriculum, we've changed as far as our MCAS test, our Common Core. Many of the things that we need, we are not able to give one-to-one devices. Every one of our students, as I look at, and I've talked about this in front of the City Council, in front of the school committee endlessly, when we look at our 10th graders sitting in front of us right now, they need to take their high-stakes test online. And that doesn't mean that you supply laptops or tablets, intermittently along the way. Every student should have that laptop, that tablet that goes home with them, that is part of their education, as you have in most of your more affluent districts. So for $10 million, our class sizes would be appropriate. I wouldn't be down 200 teachers, or the support that we need when you talk about poverty, when you talk about all of the supports that kids, social and emotional learning, things that we do very well. So I agree with you. It's very frustrating to get up and talk about any one thing, but compounded, like you said, when here we were, and I've talked about this, and I'll talk about it tonight when we do our presentation on advocacy. Brockton has been out there, and everyone knows it throughout the state, every step of the way. So when that low-income calculation changed, we were sitting there, saying, oh, wait a minute, and we were joined by many other urban districts that, again, that loss right away was $6 million. And unfortunately, when our students, and many of our students are immigrant students, they're undocumented, we also, whether we like it or not, don't have the authority to say, well, we're not teaching you in the Brockton Public Schools. We're not getting additional support for you. That's not how we operate as a system. And we went out there and lobbied for a change, a fair change, and we're still sitting here as we lost, as you said, well over 4,000 students that are still sitting in front of us. So when you look at all these factors, 10 million here, 6 million here, it has certainly taken its effect on the Brockton Public Schools. And, I've been in this district 42 years. I have been here, and I'm going to remind everybody back, and many of you were in the city bringing up your own kids. Back in the early 90s, our city was in receivership. And we basically didn't know one year as teachers if we were going to even receive a paycheck that Friday. So my point is this. We've come a long way. The McDuffie case, we fought for equity for our children. And when that money came in, the city was able to give their fair share under the formula. We built summer programs. We built after-school programs. Our high school was, for an urban center, was in World News Report, New York Times. Harvard studied it and saw what the focus was as we were able to support our kids with all the additional supports they needed. So we understand, what's at stake here. And it is not an easy fix. And I look at people out there this evening. I thank everybody for coming because it is going to take a community, not divisiveness. It is going to take a community to come together, to make sure that we are out there advocating. We continue, and Mayor, you were with me in Holyoke. We continue to go around the state. We're being invited to all different parts of Massachusetts to build those coalitions, and build them we will. So we will get there, but we as a community have to search really deep right now and come together and figure out ways, because truly what's going to happen here are the kids are the losers if we don't come together on this. And I agree with you, and I know this was not popular going back to the casino. People said to me, you're a superintendent of schools. Why would you support a casino across from Brockton High School? And the reason I supported it at the time was because looking at and really taking some time to look at the plans. It was across the street, but across the street, it also had wonderful opportunities for people to come to our city, whether it was restaurants, hotels, opportunities for jobs for quite a number of our families, good jobs with good benefits. So we have to start looking at what we need. We're no longer the shoe city. So I live in this city. I've lived here for well over 35 years. What are we doing so that we can pay our employees appropriately, so you're attracting the best teachers, the best people to come to the district to serve our urban kids? It's not an easy job. So, I thank you and our city council. I know we have our legislators represented tonight by aides to certainly Senator Brady and Jerry Cassidy I see out there. Bridget Plouffe is there. So my point is this, we need to come together as a community, and I know that's why we're here this evening, and when we have the opportunity, I'm happy to speak about the advocacy, because we are going to make a difference.
And I think that the charter school deductions, charter school funding is an important piece of this. The focus initially has been on the broken Chapter 70 formula. Everyone agrees the formula is broken. The legislature's own commission a couple of years ago found that the formula was insufficient in all these areas. But it's also the gateway cities like Brockton are being targeted by the charters. You don't see charter schools opening in Wellesley and Cohasset. And the reality is, I support the model of charter schools. I support choices for families. The problem is how we're paying for it right now. And the reality is that all of the costs of the charter schools are being taken away from the school districts that can least afford to pay it. So if they really have this mandate of wanting to have a system of charter schools across the state, then let all the 351 cities and towns contribute equally to it. Take it off the top. But to take all of that money, they are balancing the cost of charter schools on the backs of poor urban gateway cities like Brockton. And I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's constitutional. And, we hope we can rectify this working within state government. But I think we are prepared and very close to launching a lawsuit, because that may be what it takes to get the changes made that we got back with the Ed Reform Act of '93. And Brockton led the way back then, and Brockton's prepared to lead the way again now. Thank you.
Mr. Sullivan, I believe, has a question for you, Mr. Mayor.
One question. I'm sure you remember about 5 or 6 years ago when the former mayor added a percentage on the meals tax. It wasn't called a new tax or an increase in taxes. I'm not sure what it was called, but it worked. We were short money, if you remember. You were on the committee with us, and it seemed to straighten it out. I was just wondering if you had an idea.
My recollection is it didn't straighten out the whole budget. It helped cover a gap in one part of the budget. You're referring to the extra quarter of a point on the meals tax.
Yeah.
And I think that might have even been used towards covering a gap in the transportation budget that year. But that by itself didn't fix anything. And I think one of my points, Tim, is, you've got two partners that contribute to the classroom expenses in the Brockton Public Schools. You've got the state and you've got the city. And the state contributes 80% and the city contributes 20%. And that's a similar percentage in any gateway city in Massachusetts. Well, if the partner that's supposed to pay 80% isn't paying their fair share, then the partner that's responsible for 20% cannot possibly make up all of that shortfall. We've tried to make up some of the shortfall, but I don't think the answer is raising taxes on Brockton residents. The answer is getting the state to pay their fair share. We're already paying our fair share.
I mean, I'm not trying to raise taxes.
That's what it sounds like.
No, believe me, I'm not. I was just wondering if you had another way.
I think I just outlined the two with this potential millions of dollars. I think it's, I know the marijuana question gets very emotional. I didn't vote for the referendum question. But the discussion on marijuana now, it's not about whether you think marijuana is a good idea or not. That ship has sailed. It's the law now in the state. There's a Cannabis Control Commission. There's 102 pages of state regulations. And over the next few months, you're going to see marijuana businesses opening up across the state. So to me, as the mayor and the CEO of the city, this is really a revenue question. And the question is Brockton going to be one of the communities that reaps millions of dollars of additional revenue, or are we going to be one of the communities that watches their neighbors reap millions of dollars of additional revenue? And faced with those choices and looking at our school budget along with other needs, You know, I've committed 60% of the marijuana tax revenue to the schools, but, you know, we need police, we need fire, we need roads. You know, we have a lot of needs in this city. And that, I know what those dollars would mean in terms of being able to address some of these challenges that Brockton's taking on. So I just believe that we need to be one of the cities that reaps millions of dollars of revenue, not one of the cities that watches their neighbors do it. Okay?
Thank you.
Any other
else?
questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to comment with regard to the charter school issue, Brockton basically fought the charter school fight on 3 separate occasions. And I was part of that fight on all 3 separate occasions. In the first 2, we won. And when it was coming down the pike now for a 3rd time, the feeling was different because the tone on Beacon Hill with respect to the governor's office and the Secretary of Education was in very much support of charter schools. And one of the supposed legal requisites of a charter school coming into a community was that there had to be a need that was not being met. Well, there is no need that was not being met in Brockton. The current charter school that moved in does not do anything unique that our school system isn't capable of doing and does very well. We have students, as we all know, who go to the finest colleges and universities in this country. And that's because of what they get in the Brockton Public Schools. And even though, unfortunately, our students, in my opinion, deserve as much as other students get in more wealthier communities, our students are still being given the skills they need to be successful. We always have to remember that we can't instill in our children and in our students that they are victims. We have to instill that they can achieve and through education be whatever and whoever they want to be. And guess what? Our students are doing that. They are doing that despite the inequity that we face here in Brockton. So when the charter school battle was going on, every single elected official at the state level, at our city council level, and certainly at our school committee level, fought against it because there was no need. And we all said to this community, the charter school is going to be a drain on the Brockton Public Schools that will come to bite us. And guess what? We were right. It is biting us. It's biting us $10 to $13 million a year. If we had that $10 to $13 million a year, I can assure you we'd be in a much different place than we are today. So the community needs to recognize that there are things that might be unpopular, but as the mayor said, revenue streams are very important with regard to where we are as a community and the finances that we face. So unfortunately, back in the last battle with the charter schools, when we unfortunately didn't succeed to prevent it, you know, there were many in the community that were in favor of it. And, you know, those people, some of them are satisfied, and guess what? A lot of them send their kids back to the Brockton Public Schools. But the dirty secret in the game is that if you send a kid back to the Brockton Public Schools, either the charter school or a parent, and it does so after October 1st, guess what? We don't get any revenue for that child until the following year, not the year that they return to us. So, these are important issues. So we have to basically work together to make sure that we do not, once again in the future, hurt ourselves financially. Just like the mayor said, he wasn't in favor, of the vote with regard to marijuana, and many people are not in favor of gambling. But this city is hurting. And like the mayor said, unfortunately, we are not Shoe City again. I don't see huge businesses coming into Brockton in manufacturing. So we need to be cautious and careful with the businesses we allow here. We need to make sure there's oversight and there's responsible ordinances. And our city council is doing that. They're in the process of doing that with, obviously, the marijuana issue. But we all have to recognize that financially, this city needs help. So we need to work together and not fight one another in order to provide for the kids. So that being said, anyone else? No? Okay, second item. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much. I know you have to go somewhere else. Second item, I believe the superintendent is going to talk about where we were in terms of Holyoke and our coalition, or the forming of a coalition. The tale of 4 cities, but in fact, we had 5 cities. We had Chicopee show up, who is very much in favor of joining this coalition and moving forward with us. And we also have other communities that have been in touch with us, such as New Bedford, Attleboro, and I believe you've spoken to people on the North Shore. So this is moving forward. So, Madam Superintendent.
As you said, Mr. Minicello, this has been going on for quite a while. Once we realized that we were not getting the assistance that we needed quickly enough, and I do know that our state delegation has been spending countless hours, and it goes back to, and I've told the story a number of times, goes back to 2014, when we were very excited that the state was opening up a foundation budget review commission to review this foundation formula that for some communities, and if you turn it around in a more affluent community, 80% might be paid by the town as far as their resources for their schools, and 20% comes from the state. Brockton and many of your urban districts are 80% paid by the state, 20% by the district. And the other thing that we found happening was wealthier communities were able to, once they met foundation, once they put in their 80%, 20% from the state, they went above and beyond, whether it was to build new facilities, whether it was to put one-to-one devices in the hands of the kids, whether it was to make sure that their class sizes were reasonable, the kids had curriculum support, things that they needed to do to provide not just an adequate, but certainly an exceptional education for their students, training for their teachers. We in the cities have struggled, and when the commission came forward, we made sure, and I tell the story, and I thank my chief budget officer, Aldo Petronio. I went to a number of the hearings that they had all across the state. Aldo Petronio went to every single one of them. And we made sure we had an opportunity for testimony, that we talked about. In one place, we'd talk about special education. In another place, we'd talk about our English language learners. We'd talk about the poverty. We made sure we talked about the health insurance costs, the inflation. Everywhere we went, we talked about the impact on our district. When that report came out in late 2014, we were pleased because it did highlight those 4 major areas that they felt the formula was broken and needed to be fixed and reviewed. So all of that work has been done. Your governor came on board, Governor Baker, back in early 2015. I remember having conversation at that point with Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito, who had come to visit the city. And of course, they were very new. Their administration had just come in. And here we are, how many years later? So it is 4 years later. We have continued to talk about that impact, and you heard here tonight in those 4 years what the impact has been on Brockton. and other communities that I'll talk about. So, I heard somebody recently say to me, well, is there urgency here? I doubt there's urgency in Western. I doubt there's urgency in Dover Sherborne, but there sure is urgency here. So the time is to act on our state with recommendations that we have put together. I'm amazed when I listen to, and I know nobody wants to hear me talk politics, but I am amazed when I listen to during a campaign season, hearing about the millions of dollars, or actually it's billions of dollars in the state coffers. Well, that's great. That is great. The economy's doing well. So why are we still sitting here asking for those Foundation Budget Review Commission recommendations to be put forward? That little first grader sitting in Brockton only has one opportunity in first grade. And to sit in a class of 32 students is not okay. That little kindergartner who is in a larger than not class size is in a class size of 27. You go next door, 2 miles down the road, and they're sitting in a class of 15 to 17 with a paraprofessional aide in the classroom. And again, and I agree with, I don't want our students to ever feel, that they are not getting, never mind an adequate education, an education that allows them to compete in this world. So the time is now, and we started to talk about the past couple of years when there was very little action, that we were going to get out there and there was going to be advocacy. And advocacy, we made sure, we have spoken to House of Representatives, Speaker of the House, Karen Spilker, new Senate President. And many of those conversations have been excellent. I do believe that the legislature understands the importance and wants to do the right thing. And we will keep doing this. We started out by going to Worcester, I believe it was late March, early April last year. We brought a number of our school committee members attended. Aldo and I presented with the superintendent and the budget officer in Worcester, and we talked about our story. Each of these stories is a little bit different. We've had phone calls from all over the state. We're finally also in Brockton with the money that we do not have. I do want to thank the mayor and the city council for over 2 years ago putting forward some money so that we could start to look at an equity in education lawsuit to make sure that we would have a plaintiff, that we would have a voice to make sure that these recommendations were followed through. So back about 2 weeks ago, we went to Holyoke. We were invited there, and as you heard the mayor say and Tom say, that we were there with Holyoke, Springfield, Worcester, and Chicopee was in the audience, and also had conversation that evening about the number of teacher layoffs that they just started to have. So the impact that has been happening in Brockton over the past 4 or 5 years is now starting to hit many of the other urban districts. So just to review, let's just go over. I'm not going to spend time on this. We've already talked about the McDuffie case and about an adequate budget. We talked about the Foundation Budget Review Commission. And these are the 4 areas. Health insurance, these are budget busters for most districts. In our district, when you look at English language learners and low-income students, if I go to some of the surrounding towns, those last 2 are not budget busters on the towns. They certainly are dealing with health insurance costs, and they are dealing with the costs of special education in a district, a town, a city, a rural area. We're all dealing with the same. And these are, again, some of the recommendations, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but these were the recommendations. There were findings from the commission, and these are the recommendations that they have asked districts and cities and towns to implement. Special education. This is your circuit breaker cost, which is additional money given by the state to offset the high cost of educating our special needs students. And again, when you look at this, the average expenditure per pupil exceeds foundation budget even upon adoption of recommendations by $700 million. So this might not be something that we can solve all at once, but we can certainly start implementing and having a plan. And as I sit here today, there is no plan. Hence the conversations about an equity in education lawsuit. So these are the 4 communities. I'm going to show you Brockton. So let me go back to health insurance. So if you look at Brockton and what we pay, so the foundation budget allots for, and we are so heavily dependent on state funding here, $19 million. And the actual spending to keep up with the cost of health insurance, and we all know that, every one of our families knows what that cost is, it's $26.3 million. Right away, a $7.3 million gap in what we actually expend and what the foundation budget, the broken budget, would require us to spend. The area of special education, the foundation budget, with the money that we get according to the formula, would want us to spend $19.2 million, and we spend $41.3 million, a $22.1 million gap. And these are some of the things you see there. We have been trying to look at best practices, expanding our district's therapeutic day school, and inviting other towns that might have smaller special education populations to come into our city and actually tuition kids in to our therapeutic day school at the Huntington School. We are hiring our own one-to-one nurses versus going through an agency, which was very costly for some of our severely involved special education students, and eliminated third-party services for behavioral and therapeutic services, again, hiring our own speech therapists rather than contracting out to other agencies. So we continue to look at best practices to try to bring down that gap. Now, the other cities, Holyoke, and I'm not going to spend time going through, but you will see a common thread. So the foundation budget and what they spent on health insurance, 12.4, it's a much smaller district than we are. Springfield Public Schools, a much larger district, and I will say to everybody, and I know you know this, when we were up there in Springfield, they have opened up their casino. And they, in fact, are looking at, a number of dollars coming to support public education in Springfield. So again, a $32 million gap, special education, $35 million gap. It's very similar to what all of us are dealing with. Same thing. Worcester. So when you look at each one of these cities, and you look at the amount of money that we should have that we're not getting in the foundation budget, $185 million deficit. Talk about these.
So as you can see, this is just the two categories of health insurance and special education. So when you saw the $700 million figure earlier of what the state is short in funding, that report came out in 2015. We are now 3 years later. So that report, being $700 million, is probably over $1 billion at this point. So when the state is looking at funding this formula, they need to move on it sooner rather than later, because those costs keep increasing each year. So just for these 4 districts, you're looking at $185 million just to get us caught up to where we should be today. And again, if it takes 2 or 3 or 4 years to fund that, we're going to be even farther behind on that category. And this is, again, just health insurance and special ed. The costs for ELL and low income is even greater than this. So the low income, the Foundation Budget Review Commission was increased the increment by 50 to 100% of extra funding. Mass Budget and Policy Center report. The Mass Budget and Policy Center is an independent agency that goes and looks at how not only schools are funded, but other agencies around the state, and they put out reports. So a lot of the statistics that'll be quoted in here come from them. They're the ones that put out an independent thought and independent figure that most of us are working off of. They've calculated that it's close to $2 billion that the overall funding is short across the state for education. So what this slide is going to show you is the bottom line is what the foundation budget says we should be spending. So as far as administration of our schools, according to the formula, we should be spending $8.1 million. We've made so many cuts over the years to try and help the classroom. We've only spending $4.6 million on administration. Operations and maintenance, maintaining our schools. Every time we build a new school, we're supposed to submit a report on how we plan on maintaining the school, especially where all of our schools at this point have been 90% funded by the state. They say we should be spending $22.2 million, we're spending $16.6. Professional development for teachers, $3.1 million, we're spending $720,000. And probably the part that impacts the children the most is instructional materials, curriculum, books, supplies, computers. We should be spending $8.7 million, we're spending $4 million. You'll see the reason we don't have the additional money to spend what the state says we're spending is because we're paying for health insurance, we're paying for, unreimbursed special education costs, all those other items you saw earlier. So this is where it pulls from. If you're looking at the personnel side, this says that we should have 256 special education aides. We have 80. Special education teachers, we should have 235. We have 80.
Other way. So the state, the current formula allows for 80,
Oh,
but
I'm
under
sorry.
special education
I'll save
aides,
it.
we actually have to have 256 for compliance.
Exactly.
Same thing
So-
with the teachers.
Same thing with the teachers. So what you see here is that more of our resources are going towards areas that are not being properly funded by the state.
So if you look at the last one, your non-special education teacher, those are your gen ed teachers. And the formula provides for us to have about 1,400 teachers, which is exactly where we should be at. Instead, you see us at 1,000. And that's when you hear us talk about how else can we balance a budget. We do whatever we can, which is why we immediately went after curriculum, supplies, professional development. We tried to stay away from the classroom. And in the end, when you talk about, and again, I felt bad for the parent in Holyoke who had a special education child and said, are you blaming special education children? Absolutely not. The children, again, it's one of our proudest moments when we make sure that every child has access to school, to curriculum, for an opportunity to grow, no matter what their circumstances. But when you have such a broken formula, and the special education laws are very clear, they're mandated that educational plans are followed with all the additional supports and services that you heard me talk about earlier that we try to do in-house to save money. But here is the effect, a 414 teacher gap in our district. And that is not, when you hear some towns talking now about demographically, they're losing population, they have a demographic shift, and they're having to downsize, that is not what is happening in Brockton.
So that 414 teacher gap would actually decrease our class size across the district if the state were to fund us for this portion.
And these are the other districts, again. Every district is a little bit different. Aldo and I talk about how we even code things could be a little bit different.
Exactly.
So everyone presented that evening in Holyoke. Springfield did the same, so as you see the budget analysis, it is still similar.
But the common theme is always the bottom at the corner, 744 teacher gap. We had 414 teacher gap. So everyone is pulling resources from general education and using it to supplement the rest of the budget. And again, that's what primarily affects class size and teacher pay.
So this tale of four cities, could be, the cities all over the Commonwealth. It's a similar tale that it doesn't matter what city you put up there. Some of the rural districts are also struggling with a foundation formula that does not support their needs in a district. So when you talk about our equity in education lawsuit, I feel that, again, the state is going to have to pay attention to an adequate education. And I love the cartoon about equity, and it shows kids looking how apropos tonight, a baseball game. So when you talk about kids looking over a fence, and it shows the tall youngster is able to look over the fence. He's able to see the ball game. And the next youngster has to use a crate because he's a little shorter. And the last youngster has to use a couple of crates because he is that much shorter to be able to have equity and see the game. So our kids are in desperate need of people willing to advocate to make sure that they have all the crates they need to be able to see the baseball game like every other child in this Commonwealth, that they have an opportunity to have a class size that is appropriate, that they have curriculum materials to support their learning, that they have opportunity for career, for college, all those things that we have done so well as an urban district. And we're watching again, which is why the urgency is there. If you look at the 4 communities that we highlighted here, a combined, $242 million of what we would need to be able to increase our foundation budget with the full funding of the recommendation that was made over 4 years ago. So the statewide increase is $1.8 billion. That's a lot of money. But last I heard, we have billions of dollars in our state coffers.
So again, what this means is that it was the state that put out the agency, that put out the commission, the Foundation Budget Review Commission. The purpose of that was to evaluate the entire school system and evaluate the costs and the funding that's necessary for it. That report came back, and that report basically says this, what you see up here. These are some of the amounts that the school systems are underfunded. That report has been sitting idle for almost 4 years. They just started to act on some of the special education and some of the health insurance, but there's a long way to go to get to, again, where for Brockton, $48 million more right now, we would have no issues. So that's waiting to be fully enacted and fully funded, I guess, going forward.
So this is powerful, and this is what we said. The kids are the losers here if we don't come together. So our call to action, and this is our own state Supreme Judicial Court in its interpretation of the state constitution 25 years ago, and this is the McDuffie case. This is the language, and I want to remind everybody that back 25 years ago, you had a legislature that came together back then. You had businesses that were willing to support our kids in our school. And right now, we tout leading the nation. So we are number one across this country because we invested in education, we invested in our kids. So it is that the Commonwealth has a duty to provide an education for all its children, rich and poor, in every city and town of the Commonwealth at the public school level. And that this duty is designed not only to serve the interests of the children, but more fundamentally to prepare them to participate as free citizens in a free state to meet the needs and interests of a Republican government, namely the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So this doesn't pit the affluent towns against the poor towns, against the rural towns. Every one of us benefits when our children are well educated and are able to fill those jobs that are needed state and nationwide. And that was the tale of 4 cities. But as Mr. Minicello said, we have phone calls going on. We're looking to continue to build coalitions. I do believe that the government is paying attention, and we need to come together and figure out a way to implement these recommendations to support our kids, and it has to be now.
I have some extra copies of this PowerPoint if anyone wants any.
Very nice presentation, Madam Superintendent. Thank you, Mr. Petronio. So as you can see, this issue is so important. It's bigger than any person in this room. It's bigger than any organization. This is for the benefit of our students and preparing them to compete and move forward with the best that the state has to offer. And fortunately, we have students being produced from this Brockton public school system that are the best. But we need to be able to provide, and the purpose of this informational session with the mayor as well as the superintendent and showing you basically the gravity of the numbers. We need to educate the public and show what this is really about. So we needed to make sure that people understand this is a multi-million-dollar problem. And this is a multi-million-dollar problem that has many facets to it. But I'm going to try to summarize it into 4 things, 4 components. There's a legal component, there's a political component, there's a public relations component, and there's also a advocacy component. Legally, we're putting the team together. There are law firms that are being vetted and are having discussions with us, and we're moving forward with that. Politically, here's some good news for everyone. The good news is that we've been advocating with a big advocacy campaign, and this year the Brockton Public Schools, with the help of our delegation, got an extra $6 million that we didn't have last spring, but that we had to open the schools. Again, still not where we wanted to be, but more money than what we thought we were going to end up with, and that was because of, I think, the pressure that Brockton is putting on the state. And the state, I don't believe, wants a lawsuit. They were trying to put something together this summer. For whatever reasons, they couldn't get the job done. But I think at all costs, they want to avoid this mess because A, it's a political season, and B, they know what the right thing to do is. Now, what do I need? What do we need? Well, we don't need division in the community. We need unity. I need partners. I need assistance. I need people to go out there with us. When we call on them to come to the State House and advocate and be with us, instead of 2 buses, I want 6 buses of people. When I need people to go up and be with us, if we're gonna basically campaign and be in front of a gubernatorial debate, I need people there with me. When I invite people to come to Holyoke and come to other communities, I need them to show up and be with me. I need people to help me go out in the community and talk to people that are scared and don't want to sign up for public assistance because they don't trust certain people. But there are people in this community that have relationships with other people and could assist and help us to sign people up so that their kids are counted and their kids are included in the numbers for funding. And who does that benefit? Their children and the other children. I need people to come out in this community and basically help us with mentorship programs, because of the biggest problem in this community, in this city, and in our school system is people and students that do not have a big brother or a big sister or people that can help them prepare for college, help with FAFSA forms, help with applications, because guess what? They're the first people to ever go to college in their families. So I need that help. I need community and I need groups to help me adopt a school, to basically have after-school programs, because as you can see the gravity of the numbers, guess what? Some of the programs that we would have ordinarily aren't there because we're battling with class size, and you can see the gravity of the millions of dollars that we don't have. So what do I need? I need community to come out and help adopt a school, after-school programs, help with homework assistance programs. There is so much that we can do together. There's so much that needs to be done. But, we can't miss an opportunity to go forward because this, like I said, is bigger than any of us. It's for the benefit of our kids. So we can't miss opportunities to work together. I'll be honest. I'm a pretty honest guy. There was an event that took place a few weeks ago. Was I thrilled with how it ended up? No. Can we make a positive out of it? Can we go forward and do things together? I think so. Because guess what? It's for the kids. It's bigger than all of us. So I just wanted to say that. Is there anyone on the school committee that would like to say a few words? No? Okay. I invited our public officials to come and be able to comment and basically talk about where they're at. Our city council has been instrumental in advocating for us and working with us. Every time we need support from them, they basically come to the table and work with us. Like the superintendent said, Brockton is right now the quarterback. We are the quarterback out there in the state running this show in terms of getting communities together, getting the legal team together, influencing the politicians that matter, and basically forming a public relations action to get something done with regard to equity in education. The talks that went on this summer with the Senate and the representatives, guess why they took place? because this community is coming forward and being the ones to push the issue, because we are the ones that are hurt the most. So I know we have some representatives from our legislative delegation. Would any of them like to come forward and talk a little bit about where they see things going and where things are at? Please, Representative Dubois, the mic is yours. You need to press the little button in order to, no, you just press it once and it'll go green. On the stem, yeah, there you go.
Thank
Perfect.
you so much. Thank you, Chairman Minicello and Superintendent Smith and members of the school committee. It's my first time speaking here after being a city councilor for 10 years and a state rep now for 4. It's my first visit, and you're happy to be here with all of you. I just want to express my 100% commitment to being a good team player, as I have been with each and every one of you, as well as the superintendent and all the different schools that are part of this effort. I share a suite with the state representative from Holyoke, and we're constantly talking about the issues of funding and how the state House and Senate need to get on the same page with correcting our education funding formula. And advocacy is very important because there are many state representatives and senators that represent rural communities that just don't see the problem, because it's not their children that are suffering from the underfunding. So I'm on board, making sure that everybody at the State House understands this issue. I've been advocating for it for a very long time and filed some bills concerning it in the last 2 sessions I was a state representative. I've made this clear to several people, and so it would be great to just say it right now. If I'm invited to the table, I will be there. If you want to include me in an effort to get extra funding for Brockton, I will be included. If I'm not invited to meetings and I'm not given information about what is happening as far as a plan for advocacy, I cannot be at the table if I'm not invited. So I'll let everyone know that is why when BIC had their meeting and talked about having parents and groups of faith come together and have dialogue about the funding problem, I was very excited, because not anyone here individually, but oftentimes when there are advocacy groups and advocacy happening, if the information isn't shared, it's very hard for a team to be moved forward effectively. So I am on board. I'm really excited to go to every single meeting that Brockton Interfaith has about school funding, and any meeting that this board has about school funding, to advise my advocacy at the State House to make sure that we can correct the funding, because I graduated from Brockton High in '91 when the funding was in the gutter. And I have to tell you, when I look back at it, I didn't really see a lot of champions at the legislature during that time. I looked, I saw, there were no bills. I didn't see any advocacy. The advocacy came from the bottom up, with the student from Brockton and the administration fighting and bringing that lawsuit. So I really don't want it to have to go that way, but I'm glad that we're using that as a lever to potentially unlock those dollars at the state level, because they are there, and I'm willing to do whatever I can to make sure that they get released to our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just to talk about something that you just said about the different communities, that's exactly what needs to be done.
Right.
Meaning that there are people who can assist us with regard to touching base and talking to and influencing, other communities other than Brockton, other suburbs, educate them. And that's what we need. We definitely need that. We need to talk to the communities that aren't part of sort of our urban group, but that certainly can understand, sympathize, and want to help urban education, those who don't have as much as perhaps their community. So, we need that support, and that's the public relations piece. That's where we need, the octopus, so to speak, from Brockton to spread out and reach those different places and reach those legislators, because you've been in the fight with us. Representative Cassidy's in the fight with us. Senator Brady's in the fight with us. Certainly Representative Cronin. We're all on board. We're all in the same place, but we've got to get to the others.
And I think bringing in parents, as you already have done with the Brockton Kids Count campaign, is great, and having that revitalized or reforged by this Brockton BIC coalition conversation, because the more conversation about a problem, they might be able to bring different type of leverage to the problem than maybe we can on our own. I'm a grassroots advocate at my heart, so I just think the more the power is shared, the less it can be corrupted by, not that any of us would, but just by individuals making decisions that maybe everyone isn't involved with. I know that our superintendent is wonderful. I have a lot of respect for you. I have respect for you, Tom, and I'm really honored that we have Kathy Smith as our superintendent. So none of this is in any way a negative. I'm just saying that as a grassroots activist myself, I really like bottom-up power. So I'm really excited to attend these meetings. And there are people from Sharon there, so that's expanding the bubble. And often I talk to the state representatives from Newton who tell me that she fights for kids and community members in my town, in my city of Brockton, who are low income, because that's what her constituents who are wealthy want her to do. So we do have to grow that feeling of common purpose on making sure our children have the opportunities that every child should have.
It's interesting that you say that, Representative, because one of the things that I took away, and I see it every day, as a matter of fact, tomorrow I'm up here at Brockton High School for what I call Student Voices. And I take an opportunity to have lunch with a group of students. I think I've mentioned to people whether I start with the seniors, juniors, sophomore, freshmen. I finish up with the seniors every year. We have excellent dialogue. There are no other administrators there. I talk to them alone, but I'm going to tell everybody out there. The most important thing when we attended the BIC event, and it seems like whatever event, when kids have an opportunity to talk. So that evening, we had 2 students that were there. One student talked to you about the opportunity she has in our STEM cohort. So that's something we started about 4 years ago, our 9th graders, and it was only a group of, I believe, 45 students. And we had teachers that had additional professional development. Every student had a laptop. Their class sizes were capped. There were opportunities, and you heard that young girl say, but not every one of my peers has this same opportunity. You also heard the young man who talked about the classroom with 32 kids, and there might have been 25 textbooks, and they were textbooks that were older. They didn't have the things that they needed in the classroom that he's being educated. What I want to tell everybody out there, and I can't wait to talk to the seniors tomorrow, is we are making sure, and this is an effort all over this country, that these young people are going to outnumber all of us. Many of them are 18 right now. 17, coming up through the lines. They're tired. They're tired of all of us. Right. They're tired of Parkland, Florida. They're tired of having to, advocate for what they see is an opportunity for them. They can't help if they were born into families that are struggling versus families that have done well. But our kids are very bright, and they are going to make a difference for all of us. So when we talk about advocacy and we talk about parents, that's terrific. The community is terrific. We talk about coming together, but I guarantee you these kids, because that is going to be my conversation with them tomorrow. I'm not going to talk about the textbooks, the laptops. I'll talk very briefly, but I'm going to talk about how important it is, and I know this is going on in classrooms all over our city, making sure our kids understand the civic duty, making sure they understand they have a voice, and they're going to have that voice at 18 years old, and to also educate everybody. They're pre-registering these kids at 16 years old. So come that 18th birthday, they're registered. They're on those rolls. So they'll be out there voting for every one of you that, put your time into public service, and thank you for all you do.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Could I just ask her one question? Michelle?
Representative Dubois, Mr. Sullivan always
so
just
happy
has
to be
one,
with you.
he has
Thank
one
you.
quick question.
I love it.
I just wanted to make a statement. The last week, when the big event took place, I'm hoping it didn't bring it to a head then, but we've been short money for like 4 or 5 years now. Just last year alone, we were short $16 million. This year was short another 8, with over 400 teachers laid off. So we are really in trouble. We need help, whether it's the big people or the state legislators or the city council. Somebody has to do something, because we're really hurting.
Right, and so I think that a lot of people are doing a lot, and I think that's wonderful, and we do need to add people to that effort. So we looked at our school funding and the increases that we have seen and not for a long time, including the amount, 10 years I was on the city council. So there were years I was on the city council that the school funding was shorter, And we were able to supplement by a huge amount the amount that the school is funded. And I'm not saying that in a city like Brockton, that is easy. But, you know, a budget is a moral document. So if the schools are $16 million short, I think that's why our delegation at the State House redoubled our efforts and tried very hard in an area where 3 of us against 160 other, 160 members wasn't easy, and we do need to get more funding. But I'm glad that the city was able to put in some extra dollars, but sometimes that's what has to be done. And I think that, like I said, I know the city council, when I was on there, would supplement those shortfalls, but we can't do that forever, of course. I know we do need to fix this school funding formula that has obviously been studied and shown to be unfair to urban communities. So I'm on board with you.
And just one thing, Michelle,
You're limited to one quick question.
This is
Mr.
real
Sullivan. All right, we'll be good to you. Go ahead.
I just want to give credit to the other school committee members. We have a budget that is handed to us, and we don't take any extra home with us. We spend every single cent and put it into the classrooms, it goes to the teachers, or goes to health insurance. And we're still short. What we have to do then is lay off teachers. And I was just thinking to myself, when the mayor was here, I don't think there's anybody else in any other departments that are laid off, except for the schools. It just doesn't seem right to me.
Well, I have to tell you, I don't envy you every year when these decisions are made in the school administration, and I know they're difficult, and I know you all take them very personally and soberly and seriously, and that you have the best intentions of the children at heart. And I also know that you're not responsible for the origination of the budget, that you can do cuts. I think you can do some moving. I'm not sure about that. I know that you can cut, but
We can do
adding more
cuts.
money to a school budget
We can't
is
do
not
that.
within your powers. So it is the mayor's budget, and that is just our form of government. And so I tell you, I will work with the administration, any member here, because I know you all really care very deeply about our school system, so to try to solve this problem.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Are you done, Mr. Sullivan?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Anyone else? No? Okay. Would anyone else out of our public officials like to say a few words? Great. Counselor Tim Sullivan. I'm Tim Cruz. Timothy Cruz. I've got Mr. Sullivan on my mind. Counselor Timothy
I'm the good
Cruz
Tim.
from Ward. Yeah, there you go.
I'll actually just
Welcome,
speak for a
Counselor
second.
Cruz.
I wasn't going to speak, but I did want to because you made a very good point while you were speaking a couple minutes ago. The
Once in a
meeting,
while, I make a good point.
Once
Some
in a
people
while.
disagree, but once in a while.
the meeting a week or two ago was very frustrating, but it was frustrating because everybody's heart is in the right place. And I was a little disappointed not being able to speak because I think there were people who think that if you didn't agree with the process that BIC was taking, you weren't in favor of what was going on. I think I don't need to defend my commitment to this issue. I'm a lot older than most of you. I was around when the McDuffie case was actually being heard, and I actually was the co-chairman back before ed reform of the Prop 2.5 Citizens Committee that we were forming to do a Proposition 2.5 override, which is not the answer, by the way, to any of these issues. But I was the chairman back in the early 90s with Richard Bath of the committee that was putting that together until eventually, basically, ed reform finally carried through. I will say that, one thing I disagree with the superintendent on, I do still call it the New Brockton High, and I was a graduate of the first class here. I have 3 children who've gone through the system, and I would never send them anywhere else, even now. And in fact, many of you don't know it, I have a son who teaches special ed at North Middle School, and he can really tell me what goes on and why we need to not only look at the funding mechanisms, but the state has to identify and realize that an average of per student, and just say that Cambridge spends this, and Newton spends this, and Brockton spends this, is one of the most silly ways to look at that, because the students we're educating cost much, much more than a student in Westwood or Dedham costs to educate. And in fact, one of the issues we've had is when ed reform finally got enacted, actually, because of how badly the funding mechanisms were set up back then, the funding favored, we had some great years in Brockton as far as the help that the state gave us, because it was the right thing to do, and cities like Brockton did well. And I can tell you that what really happened is, eventually those urban districts got jealous. And the reason that changes came about...
Suburban districts.
the suburban, exactly. You're right again. Those suburban districts got jealous of...
Twice? Oh, my goodness.
And they identified an amount of money instead of what a problem was. And they, to this day, what I think our legislative delegation does, and what Representative Dubois can do with her with her colleagues in those offices, is explain to them what a difference is for a Chicopee and a Holyoke and a Brockton. I agree completely. We will educate anyone, and we do a better job than anyone. And by the way, the fact that we have all those students is why I would never send my kids anywhere else. I can tell you that my 3 children, when they got to college, were more prepared for life than every one of those kids. My daughter went to Providence College. My son went to Stonehill. They were amazed at how unprepared for life those children were. They were educated, okay, in a book sense. They were so unprepared for life, it was amazing. My children are not, because they know what everything's about. They've worked with and gone to school with Cape Verdean children with, I mean, I love to tell a story that at one graduation, I believe there were 100 languages, students graduating that spoke 100 different languages or dialects. That's an education that nobody can give. All we're saying is be fair with it. And then I think you know my other frustration is we shouldn't even have to start this lawsuit again. We won this lawsuit. The state is breaking the law. That's the only way you can put it. The state is breaking the law by not funding under the processes that the Supreme Court ruled 25 years ago. And I think that's why they're starting to say we've got to do something, because they realize they're going to lose this lawsuit again. And then they're going to have to come up with it again, and it's much better off if we don't all have to spend lots of money on attorneys and spend 5 years doing this, because you know what? There is a sense of urgency, because some child who's in the 6th grade right now, if we don't help him now, they're going to get out of school, and we've lost that generation. We can't wait 5 years and 10 years to do this like we did. I mean, the McDuffie case became the McDuffie case because it was the Hancock case, and she graduated. That's how long it took to do it. We don't have that kind of time. We can't lose these kids now. And the other things that somebody like Representative Cassidy and Representative Dubois can say to their colleagues, these kids, you need to educate these kids to help your own cities and towns. They're not just Brockton's. We don't have, as much as some people would like it, we don't have a wall around Brockton and around Worcester and around Chicopee. We are one boat. And if we don't educate all of these children, we're going to lose another whole generation. And we don't have time for that. So I do appreciate the fact that you reminded me that it's not about being a little upset because some people didn't get to speak. It's about that we all have to work together to get this done. And again, we've been working on it for many years, and let's get this done, and I appreciate it. And as I said afterwards, I work with anybody from BIC or anywhere else, because it's not about an agency or a group or anyone. It's about getting this done for the kids that live in the city and the state and the country. So let's get this done. Thank you.
Okay, wait. I get to respond, don't I? Because you disagreed with me.
Yeah, you
So I
still-
would like to ask anybody if you've got something 50 years old and it's not old.
Excuse me,
This is not
excuse
the
me,
new
I just
Brockton
turned
High.
62 and I'm not old.
Well, I don't know about you. Whatever I own that's 50 years old is old.
And by the way, that's, one of the problems we have is that we don't recognize in this state, we call the school budget the foundation budget. It does not recognize the actual cost of education. Retiree benefits, they are part of the school budget. Health insurance is part. The fact that some cities get to claim transportation and some don't because they didn't file it that way the first year is ridiculous. The fact that October 1st comes and that's when the money ends, it's not that difficult in this day and age to 3 or 4 times in a year for the state could adjust that. That again, that amazes me. What would be the difficulty in this day and age to say, okay, you had 16,000 students October 1st, you now have 16,900 that left the charter school, that money's going back to the city. I can't believe that in this day and age, we can't do that. And Aldo may tell me that's too much work, but
I believe there's one other date after the October 1st.
There's a date in March which is used for some of those calculations, but I asked that at our committee meetings with the state, that they push the date out.
That they push, but in my opinion, it could be multiple times
Yeah,
a year.
that's- we
It should
asked
be.
for that.
It's not that difficult,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to say, it is interesting when you talk about, Brockton High School, because I will tell you this, if you look at our own stage, which is right here, this is the little theater you're in.
Right.
We produce some of the most wonderful students in fine arts, whether it be the artists out here in this wing, our students, our music program, and we've really hung on to that. And it is just so important when you go into, and our drama team always ends up into the State Drama Festival, the competition, and you go in there, we are by far the only urban district in there competing and winning many, many awards. But I say that, and I understand it doesn't just make a building. It is the teachers, it is the community support, it is our school committee, our city officials funding those things to make sure our kids have opportunities for sports, for the fine arts, for things that really help them as they look on to their future. But I will say this, when you start looking at these beautiful new high schools, and I've said it in front of the city council, I've said it in front of the school committee, and certainly in front of the community, and they have state-of-the-art science labs. Things right now that we know are going to change for kids before tomorrow comes, my goodness. The information stream, we just can't even keep up with it. So when you have an old building, and again, we're doing all kinds of things to try to provide labs and to try to redo things here, but we desperately need a new high school, or you've heard me talk about a big STEM wing, where we can then transfer our kids house by house and renovate, and the state is looking to give dollars to Brockton.
And I agree with you completely on that. And I think back to 1970 when I was a freshman here, the day the school opened, and this was probably the best building in the country as a high school, in the country. And it attracted, and it's one of the things that makes Brockton great, is the education system. We have never, ever said we will turn a blind eye to anyone. The education going back, the George Round Little Theater, there was a school committee of people that had wonderful vision, and we have always educated our kids. We have never given up, and as difficult as it is right now, we still, it amazes, I have people across the state that I know in other urban communities, and they talk about the fact, you still have band, how much do the kids pay? And the kids paid zero, because we could never do that. We would never be able to charge a user fee for sports or for any of the, I always say that the three buildings that count here are in the middle and the two ends, because the gym, this building, and the core building, which most people still get lost, I could still walk you through the whole building, but the core building, which was the science building, and again, was the state of the art. And now it is the part that has to be updated. You can teach history in a square room anywhere. You can't teach science and math in just a square room anywhere. You need the right tools to do that. And we can't lose those children, and they're the most important subjects nowadays. So we need those, and we do need to get those things done, and the state needs to recognize that as part of the process of education. So it's still the new high school, though. And I drive by the old high school every day.
The old high
Thank
school.
you. But thank you for reminding me what's important, Mr. Minichiello.
Thank you, Counselor Cruz.
Thank you.
Okay, Al, did you want to come up? I thought I saw you moving.
I have to tell you how wonderful Al is. Whenever we go into the State House, he's always there to greet us for Senator Brady. He gets me to the right place where we can share our story, and thank you, Al, for always getting back to me within a moment of my calling. I really do appreciate it.
It's a pleasure and a good education for us to have you and Aldo in there, because we've learned a lot about the situation. I just wanted to apologize on behalf of the senator that he couldn't be here. He had another commitment in Hanover at the same time. And I know I don't have to explain to anybody in this room about his work ethic and his commitment to education. And he does understand that even though he's managed to get a few $1 million here and there every year in the Chapter 70 budget, that it's not even a Band-Aid, and there's well more needed to be done. And you have his commitment to see that, that number one, the foundation budget bill gets through, and that the school systems in the state get the right funding. And
I know Senator Brady was there in May when we came to the State House. As Mr. Minicello said, we might have had 2 buses, we had community members, we had students, we had elected officials, Kim Gibson from the Brockton Education Association, we had teachers, we had representatives there, but again, we'd like to see lots of buses. But, Senator Brady was there to greet us. The kids, truly got an opportunity to hear Senator Sonia Chang Diaz talk about the hard work that had gone on with the commission and going forward, the support for all students in the Commonwealth. So that was very much appreciated.
our pleasure. And I have the pleasure of spending 1 year in this building. And
Call it the old high school now?
it'll always be known to me as the new high school. And it couldn't have been more than 10 or 12 years ago.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would anyone else, any other public official like to say a few words? No? Okay. I would like to recognize City Councilor Ann Beauregard, who is here. I'd also like to recognize from Ward 4, Susan DeCastro, who's here, Councilor DeCastro. And I'd also like to recognize Bridget Plouffe, who is here on behalf of Representative Cassidy. Representative Cronin expressed to me her regrets that she couldn't be here, but she also had another engagement. Let me just say this, we are all in this together. Everyone in this room cares about the right thing, and that is the Brockton students and what our kids need to go forward and how to be prepared for the future in terms to compete. So it's basically time, again, everyone can now see the magnitude of the millions of dollars and where the dollars are going. This is not a penny pinching type of situation that the city can do on its own. The city can help us once in a while with a Band-Aid for something or other, but this is a major reformulation of the budget, the state budget. And again, behind us, Worcester, Springfield, Holyoke, Chicopee, New Bedford, Fall River, Lynn, Lawrence, Lowell, they're all in the same boat, in addition to some of the rural communities that are the poorer rural communities out in the western part of the state. This is something that has to be reworked, at the state level, because, like the mayor said, they are the big elephant, in the circus, basically, and they have control over the budget. And again, this administration wants to be so proud of itself and say, "Oh, God, we've given more to education ever." You know what? Yeah, technically that's correct. Technically that's correct. But when you look at the fine print, you can see what they've done, and that is they've moved the goalposts on communities like Brockton. They've moved the goalposts with regard to how we fund our low-income students. They basically moved the goalpost with respect to how insurance is basically funded with regard to, like Councilor Cruz said, the retiree health insurance, and they despicably moved the goalpost on us with regard to charter schools, because Brockton had no unique problem, nor did that charter school have a unique solution to something that we couldn't get done, nor were we not doing. And that is draining this community. So, that being said, and getting that off my chest, I'm really glad that everyone was here. I hope that this was informative. I hope the purpose of tonight was to really show the community that these funding issues are something that need to be addressed, must be addressed. Brockton is the quarterback right now. We are the one driving this whole equity in education issue, and we will continue to do so. But this is basically a call to action. We need everyone's help, because we've got to expand. We've got to take this show on the road, basically. Because it's not just this little pocket here. We have to show that the funding formula is broken. not for just Brockton, but the funding formula as a whole. And that means it's not working for other communities, which we certainly can prove. Madam Superintendent.
Under other business, as I had told the school committee, once we saw school up and going, I would take a look at pockets of need. I'm still not pleased with class size in the district. We have some areas that show promise, other areas that are still large classes. I'll continue to monitor that. But we do have a need for, up at the high school, some of this is compliance with our special education students. We are down to 3.5 school adjustment counselors, and we had four for years. So I would like to recommend 3 additional positions at the high school between school adjustment counselor and guidance. And again, some of that is compliance for special education. And I need 1 ESL teacher at the Angelo School, and this would be funded from the monies that we spoke about before school started that we put away in order to take a look at the district as we registered for kindergarten, saw where our students landed. That's not to say I won't come back with another recommendation, but at this point here, that would be 4 positions. And the ESL is bilingual education compliance.
You need a vote on that this evening?
Well, you voted for us to, you know, just letting you know that's what I'm going to be using the money for as we start school.
Okay, so it's already been approved by us.
Yes.
Okay, so there's no need for an additional.
Well, if you've got people here to vote, you can vote on these positions. I'd like to have the support for these positions.
Okay, all right. So,
This is Brockton High, so it's between guidance and school adjustment counselor. I haven't figured out exactly what it will be, but it will be 3 positions in guidance and SAC. It could be 2 SACs and 1 guidance. I think that's what it's going to be.
okay, all right, then, a motion to provide the superintendent with the flexibility to determine whether she needs a SAC guidance or ESL.
And I do need the ESL as English as a second language at the Angelo School, and that's because of compliance and numbers.
And an ESL instructor at the Angelo School. Can I get, Mr. Sullivan, you're good at that. Can you make a motion?
Yes, I will. Was it 4 positions?
It is 4 positions.
I'd like to make a motion that the 4 positions that the superintendent mentions tonight was a adjustment counselor and an ESL. Was it 3 adjustment
In
counselors?
guidance. It is 3, it'll be up at the high school. I think it'll be 2 school adjustment counselors and 1 guidance. I'm working with Dr. Murray in the guidance department to look at compliance. We have a number of 9th graders that continue to be repeaters. They're not getting to the 21 credits. I need to provide them with additional support from a dedicated guidance counselor anyway. I definitely need an adjustment counselor for the additional students that we have at the high school, and the other will be either an adjustment or a guidance counselor.
I'd like to make a motion that the 3 adjustment or counselors at the high school and the 1 ESL at the Angelo be made available.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Great. Okay, anything else?
That is it.
Okay.
Oh,
Mr.
I'm sorry.
Petronio,
Yeah.
how are you? Like to come up?
Trying to remember what I forgot.
I'm not looking for a motion, but I just want to inform the committee that I'm in the process right now of looking at leasing 4 new police vehicles, also some trucks for DPW. Police vehicles, what we currently have are Crown Vics, Crown Victorias. They've stopped making them, I think, 2012. So we bought used cars for the past 10 years, and we have some hand-me-downs from the Brockton Police. They were all well over 100,000 miles in our fleet, and it's not, they're no longer
Can't maintain them.
safe to really be driving. So I looked at purchasing, I looked at leasing. There's a lease option with a state contract vendor called MHQ. They provide us all our vehicles, and there's also a state contract leasing agent that can lease them to us. So I'm looking to lease them over 3 years, then we own them in the 4th year. I'm looking to do the same thing with the some F-250s and some F-150s. Same thing with our trucks. We bought all used trucks. Lots of maintenance issues. Of course, the maintenance issues happens in the middle of a snowstorm. It never happens in a nice sunny day in the summertime, but we'll be paying for these from the facilities revolving account. It won't be coming from local monies. This is monies we receive, from renting out the auditoriums, and around the school and other facilities. So I'll be using those funds, and the fact that we're leasing it, putting it over 3 years, spreads the cost out enough that I think the life of these vehicles, as in the past, will be 10 years or more. So the investment will be worth the time and the trouble, the repairs of our vehicles. So just want to let you know, because I don't want you to see these new vehicles and wonder where they came from and how they got here.
Okay.
So,
All right, thank you for the information. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay, can I entertain a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, all in favor? Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you for attending.